So I guess we'll get started. Good morning, my name is Jesse Silva. Thank you all for attending this presentation. I'm the librarian for Federal and State Government Information, Political Science, Public Policy, and Legal Studies, say that 5 times fast, at the University of California at Berkeley. This presentation will cover LGBTQ history, life, and culture as seen through the lens of government information. Specifically through the information produced and published by the United States government. I hope this presentation, in keeping with the themes of this conference, I hope this presentation helps to remove walls and barriers to this history and helps you to provide access to all your patrons. And to quote Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka, I hope you enjoy it. I think you will. Before we begin, a little bit of history about this particular project. My colleague, Kelly Smith from UC San Diego, and I began compiling a number of the documents I'm going to cover during the summer of 2016 for a presentation at the Federal Depository Library Conference in Washington, D.C., and we've been adding to that original list since then, including some of the more regressive actions by the current presidential administration. One other thing to understand is we decided to begin looking at documents published after 1789, which is the year Congress first met. So we ignored some Revolutionary War era people who have been previously written about, like Deborah Sampson and Baron von Steuben. As you may know, this is history that hasn't been fully written down, and in doing this presentation, this is actually the 4th version of this presentation. We've discovered and incorporated stories from people that have made this presentation and project more interesting. So if you know of any additional stories or would like to talk further about this, please let me know. I believe we cannot move forward without knowing our past, and our LGBT past goes back much further in this country than most people realize. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover. There we go. A quick brief outline of what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology we use for finding these documents. We're going to do a little bit of an audience participation exercise, and don't be scared. I'm going to talk about selected documents from 1789 to World War II, talk about the impact of World War II on the LGBTQ movement, and then we're going to start talking about more current documents from World War II to present, and then specifically about what's happened in the last couple of years. And you may be asking, what can I do with all this information that I'm going to learn in this session? And I'm going to give you some ideas on what you can do with that. So a little bit about the methodology. So Kelly and I both started out with a fairly strong background on LGBTQ history. So we had some idea of what we wanted to look for, and there may be some folks in the room who have similar strong backgrounds on this topic as well. We started with books and articles on LGBTQ history and trying to look for those sources that were already in there. And then we started looking through the various government information databases, ProQuest Congressional, LexisNexis Academic, the American Presidency Project, and just trying to find things that just we weren't fully aware of and weren't published about. And in some cases, we found things that that even people who have published books and articles on this topic did not know about. One thing to understand, excuse me, let me get my notes correct. One thing that became obvious very quickly was that there was a wide range of terminology that we needed to search for, because the terminology has changed dramatically over the years, and especially the recent time. And also to understand that the historical terminology reflects the social prejudices of the time. Whenever I teach students how to do historical research, I always tell them they may need to use terms and phrases that they personally find offensive. And that was one of the things that we realized in doing this project. The terms you see on the slide were the most likely to be used in the documents that we're going to look at, but something to keep in mind if you do your own research on this topic, or if you help others do this research, there are some really tricky terms to be aware of. For instance, hermaphrodite also means a type of ship. Gay could mean happy, queer could mean strange, and lesbian, especially in the 19th century, referred to people from the island of Lesbos. Okay. And so now that we have a fairly basic understanding of how we did this project, let's start getting the mental juices flowing on LGBTQ history. And since I'm from an academic institution, we're going to do an LGBTQ history pop quiz. And so what we're going to do in this quiz is we're going to look at when these terms first appeared in the major U.S. documents. And the terms that we're looking at are homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered. And by the major documents of the U.S. government, I'm talking about the congressional record, which is a transcription of everything said on the floor of Congress, from speeches and debates to presidential State of the Union, public papers of the president, which is everything the president has said in public, including interviews, statements, speeches, and Supreme Court opinions, because we thought that Supreme Court would be the final say-so in the legal realm, and it represents the judicial branch of the government. So, the way this works is, when do you think the word homosexual first appeared in the congressional record? When do you think it was first spoken in the floor of Congress? What year? 70s? Which one? 40s? Anything else? 20s? 1917? Okay. It was actually first spoken in 1920s, 1927, by Representative Kindred of New York, referencing studies done on sexual rejuvenation. And these are studies that we would look at today as being conversion therapy, converting people from being homosexual or bisexual back to being heterosexual. What president do you think was the first to say homosexual in public? Reagan? Any others? Carter? Any others? Roosevelt? It was actually Gerald Ford. He gave a special message to Congress, and in the message he references homosexual rape happening in prisons. And what year do you think the Supreme Court may have written about this? Take a guess. 90s? Earlier, later? 70s? Actually, 1952 in the case Sweeney versus Woodall. Sweeney was an escaped convict who was recaptured in, he was escaped from, I think, Louisiana and was recaptured in Tennessee. And when he was recaptured, he said the reason that he escaped prison was because he was treated poorly and raped. And the Supreme Court actually references, and the earlier courts reference, a lot of the details that are what happened to him in prison. And this is a direct quote from the Supreme Court case. So if homosexual first appears in 1927, when do you think lesbian first appears in the congressional record? When do you think it was first spoken on the floor of Congress? Later? Earlier? Later? Okay. It was actually first spoken just a couple months later, in 1927. Just a couple months later, Representative Wilson from Mississippi references a list of dirty plays, and the play that he's talking about is The Captive by Edouard Bourdet. My French is awful. This was a September 1926 production that was put on at the Empire Theater in New York City and ran for about 17 weeks before it was closed because of the subject matter dealing with lesbianism. The North American Theater Online calls it, quote, a sensationally controversial drama, the first serious treatment of lesbianism seen on Broadway. So which president do you think was the first to say the word lesbian in public? Nobody? Anyone? Reagan? George H.W. Bush. He was asked in 1991 about the Episcopalian Church ordaining a lesbian, and he was an Episcopalian. He's an Episcopalian. So when do you think lesbian first appears in Supreme Court opinions? What year? 60s? Anyone else? 50s? 1964, Equality of Copies of Books et al. Versus Kansas. The state attorney of Kansas seized a bunch of books to burn because they thought that they were obscene, and one of the titles was Lesbian Love, and it's written about in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that the seizure was unconstitutional, which is a good thing. Okay, so bisexual. What year do you think bisexual first appears in the floor of Congress? Someone's actually said bisexual in Congress. The other two were from the 20s, yes? Yes, 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 yes. What we mean is someone who's attracted to both sexes, yes. Maybe 20s? Anyone else? 90s? 40s? It was actually 1945. And this was actually not spoken on the floor of Congress. It was actually in the extension of remarks. But Joseph Clark Baldwin ran out of time, and the extension of remark, this was in the next paragraph he was about to say. And he references Caligula being bisexual and that being leading to the downfall of Rome. This was during World War II, looking at societies falling. So that's what they were looking at. What president do you think was the first to say bisexual in public? Clinton? Johnson? It was actually Obama. He proclaimed June 2009 as Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Pride Month. This kind of speaks to like the invisibility of some of these communities within the LGBT movement. When do you think it first appears in Supreme Court opinions? What year? 2000? 2000s, okay. Anyone else? (1964) Bottlier versus the INS. Bottlier was a Canadian citizen working in the United States, was arrested at a gay bar, and once they found out he was a citizen of Canada, they deported him because he was constitutionally psychopathic. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And bisexual is used in reference to reviewing expert opinions on psychology at the time in the opinion. Now we get to transgender. Who do you think, or when do you think the first mention of the word transgender occurs in Congress? 90s? Anyone else? 80s? Anyone else? 1994 by the infamous Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina. And he's complaining about the National Endowment for the Humanities funding a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender film festival. So 1994. Who was the first president to say the word transgender in public? You got a hint. It was Obama when he proclaimed June 2009 as Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Pride Month. And when do you think it appears in Supreme Court opinions? '90s? Prop 8 was in 2008. It was much more recent. It was in 2012 in Manincy versus Pillard, and it appears in reference to the courts being bound to protecting special populations in prisons. Okay? So this history spans a little further than a lot of people realize and goes back a little further. And so what we're going to look at now is some pre-World War II documents. And what you see mostly in the earliest documents is the federal government republishes laws of other states, including the District of Columbia. And what they're republishing is sodomy laws in these things. There's a little more if you dig a little deeper. So for instance, in 1888, after the 10th census, there's a listing of prisoners across the United States and why they were in prison. And one of the reasons was sodomy. And why it was published in the 1800s, I have no idea, but that's what they published and that's what they decided to publish. We get into some really interesting things beginning in the 1840s. In 1847, the Navy conducted a series of investigations of men meeting for sex at night between ship cannons on board the ships. This led to a report on the issue and the results in the form of punishments handed out, including lashings and imprisonment. The image you see at the time is from a newspaper on the East Coast, and this image was provided to me by Bill Benneman. He's a former archivist at the Berkeley Law School and has written a number of books on early history of LGBTQ communities, including one was recently published on if Lewis and Clark were actually lovers. And this caused a lot of controversy when it was published by the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation in 2015. There's a couple things that happened along U.S. history that affect LGBTQ communities, but aren't really specifically about LGBTQ. One of them is the 1873 Comstock Law, also known as the suppression of trade in and circulation of obscene literature and articles of immoral use. And what this did, it prohibited citizens of the U.S., anyone from using the post office, and the post office itself from sending out sexual information, including erotica, contraceptives, anything dealing with abortion, personal letters containing sexually explicit information, and this had very long-lasting negative effects on issues dealing with sexuality and reproduction. This is what Margaret Sanger was getting in trouble for when she was pushing again for birth control. This is why, and this went into the 1950s, and we'll look at what that looks like when we get to that point. But if you start digging deeper, you start to see some really strange things in the federal record. So one of the things that sodomy has been used against, preventing of homosexuals from immigrating into the United States, was because they thought that they were going to pollute the U.S. And this becomes very clear in Chinese Exclusion Acts, prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1980s. Testimony from Representative Piper of California in 1877, talking about the Chinese that were coming in were all engaged in sodomy. And he gets really, really graphic if you read this. It sounds like language out of South Park, some of the stuff that's in here. It's just kind of strange. And we started laughing when we saw this, talking about, I've seen this thing, I've seen this. This is about as graphic as we're going to get, but it gets really graphic for the time period. And this wasn't the only hearing like this. There's a number of hearings when you start looking at this that you start to see these things happening. In 1893, you have the story of a lesbian murderer, published in the Transactions of the First Pan American Medical Congress, held in Washington, D.C. And in this, you have the story of a woman who killed her girlfriend, partner, and it's a kind of a sad story, but there is some like really strange pseudoscience stuff in here. You see things like, had this woman been treated for worms, constipation, or any other thing and been given a diet of bread and water, she wouldn't have become a lesbian. Possibly, but this girl did become so, and she was insane, the last line. So you get to see some strange things in these publications. The other thing that you see is the first use of the word homosexual, also in the same report. And in this report, you see this, the second paragraph is the suicide note written by a man to his partner who was getting married to a woman at the time. And it gets really, really depressing. The second to last line, men of our natures and sins must have their punishment, and ours comes in a terrible shape. You are mine in the light of heaven, and no family ties can claim you from me in death. Very, very sad, very depressing time period. But it's not all sad and depressing. This is an image of Wiwa. Wiwa was a Zuni woman who was born as a man, lived her entire life as a woman. And the Bureau of American Ethnology, which is a publication from the Department of Interior and the Smithsonian Institute, wrote about Native American cultures at the time and includes a small little paragraph by Matilda Cox Evans, who was one of the first women anthropologists. She met Wiwa, was friends with Wiwa, and there's a line in here about some declared him to be a hermaphrodite, but the writer gives no credence to the story and continued to regard Wiwa as a woman, and as he was always referred to by the tribe as she, it being their custom to speak of men who don women's dress as if they were women, and as the writer could never think of her faithful and devoted friend in any other light, she will continue to use the feminine gender when referring to Weewa. This is 1904. Weewa is also a little complicated because we can't really say that Weewa was trans because we don't know all that much, and we can't really assume that. We don't want to be colonialists and try to put our name in a way that we think are Western ideas onto Weewa, but Weewa has been claimed by the Native American community as being a symbol of their version of LGBTQ. And so in that respect, we can look at her in that respect. And we get to the best kept secret of the American Civil War. Albert Cashier was a Union soldier during the Civil War. He fought in approximately 40 battles, with the Battle of Vicksburg being the most significant. During the Battle of Vicksburg, Cashier was captured while performing a reconnaissance mission in May of 1863. He escaped by wresting a gun away from a Confederate guard and was chased on foot, barely reaching the Union lines for safety. But Cashier had a secret. When in 1911, he was discovered to have been born a woman. He injured his leg, and the doctor who was examining him discovered that he was a woman. This entire time, everyone thought of him as a man. And so since he was hospitalized, he needed money to pay for his medical bills, he applied for his pension. And the pension office said, no, because you're a woman. And so he appealed, and the pension office went out and interviewed soldiers, his commanding officer, and found out that they all testified in support of him getting his pension. And you can actually read this. This is in the National Archives. If you go to the National Archives website and search Albert Cashier, you'll get about a 50-page PDF file. It takes a little while to download, and it has the actual letters you can actually read from these folks talking about that he should get his pension. He got his pension, but life was not all that happy for Cashier after that point. He had declining health, and he ended up going into a mental institution at the end of his life where he was forced to wear a dress. Kind of a very sad story, but it's also interesting to note that Cashier was not the only woman who dressed as a man and fought during the Civil War. There were a number of others who did this. There's about 4 books that have been written on women who dressed as men that fought during the American Civil War. And the other thing to note is we don't really know if Cashier was a lesbian or trans or anywhere on the continuum, but we do know, based on various letters, that he did refer to a girlfriend, a female special close friend. So we don't know. There's no real proof, but there is some hints that he may have been a lesbian. Now we get to the 1917 Immigration Act. So Kelly and I, when we were researching this, we knew that homosexuals were prevented from immigrating into the United States because of the Immigration Act of 1917. But when you actually look at the act, there's no actual mention of homosexuality or bisexuality or anything like that in the act. What you see is, in Section 3, they're talking about persons of constitutionally psychopathic inferiority. And in doing some additional research, we found a book by Chin and Velazar, which talk about what this actually means. And in it, constitutionally psychopathic inferiority is an umbrella term for any sort of mental illness, mental defects. And at the time, homosexuality was considered a mental defect. It wasn't until the 1950s when they made this very explicit that homosexuality was grounds for exclusion from immigration. And we'll get to that point in a bit. Okay. So in doing this project, one of the things that's come out is people telling us stories that they've read about or heard about and that we did not know about because they happened in small little areas or were just forgotten about in history. And this is one of them, the Newport Scandal in Newport, Rhode Island. In 1918, a man by the name of Evan Arnold, he was a 14-year Navy man, And Lieutenant Erastus Hudson at the Navy training station in Newport, Rhode Island, thought that there were too many sodomites and perverts affecting Navy operations, and they wanted an investigation to purge everyone. So they developed a little brief outline of what they were going to do. They didn't give details of what they were going to do. And they approached the then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and asked about, can we do this? And he gave the go-ahead. What they ended up doing was they used volunteers, 18 to 20-year-old men, to get targeted individuals drunk and try to seduce them. And if they succeeded, then those men were expelled from the Navy and arrested. But the men that did the seducing, nothing happened to them. They had immunity. They ensnared about 20 men in this way, and they got a little more, they cast their net a little wider. And they ended up ensnaring a local member of the clergy. And this is when the whole scandal broke open, what they were doing. After they ensnared the clergy, there was a big scandal, a lot of newspaper reporting at the time that was very contained in Rhode Island. They read letters from FDR at the time talking about how he supported this, but FDR said he didn't know about the details of what they were going to do, and had he known, he wouldn't have done it. But the scandal really didn't affect FDR, because by 1920, he had resigned his post to run for vice president, and this kind of like went into the dustbins of history. However, Congress got hold of this thing, and after FDR lost the vice presidential bid with Cox from Ohio against Coolidge and Harding, Congress did an investigation on this, and midsummer of 1921, the New York Times called this, "The details are unprintable." And the details are the story of getting people drunk. FDR ended up leaving government service, going into private industry for about a decade before running for the governor of New York in 1928, and then president in 1932. And he kind of was free of LGBT scandals until 1943, when his friend and then Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles was forced to resign because of allegations of homosexuality in 1943. And then there's Eleanor Roosevelt. So LGBTQ history has, if you read about it, there's a dividing line in the United States. This image is from the New York Times Magazine from July of 1942, the very start of the U.S. involvement in World War II. This was actually an ad from the Navy at the time. Yeah, it's kind of funny to look at it now. But LGBTQ history is divided in the United States from prior to, during, and after World War II. The reason being, World War II was seen as a major social upheaval in the United States. What was going on in the United States was massive migrations of men and women around the country and around the world. This was at a time when most people never traveled more than 100 miles from where they grew up, and now you had the opportunity to go 100 miles, or more than 100 miles, to the opposite coast, to the other side of the planet, to aid in the war effort. This allowed people, at the end of the war, they didn't have to go back home. They ended up staying in the major port cities. This is where the economic opportunities were, social opportunities were. They may have met friends in the military that they wanted to hang out with in the major metropolitan areas of the country. Again, they did not have to go back to their hometowns. They could set up a new life away from where they grew up and the people that knew them. They could be anonymous. And the major port cities included New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And after World War II, this is where you start seeing the homophile organizations, the early gay rights organizations begin springing up. In LA, you have the Mattachine Society. In San Francisco, you have the Daughters of Bilitis. In New York City, you have other chapters of the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. And so World War II had a major impact on this. It also caused a backlash because of the organizing that was happening. This has been written about a lot. You can find a lot of material about this. The 1950s Lavender Panic. The government at the time wanted to purge homosexuals and other LGBTQ folks from the government because they were seen as security risk, because they had a secret, and because of that secret they could be blackmailed. And so they needed to be purged in order to risk being blackmailed. And there's a number of reports that come out during this time, a number of hearings about this. And one of them is by a senator named Huey, which I call the report a pile of Huey, because it's really kind of interesting to just read through. The 1950s, the Lavender Panic continued through the 1950s, leading to Executive Order 10450 by Eisenhower. This was the first inclusion of sexual perversion as a basis for removal from federal government employment. This was signed in 1953. After this, the most famous person to lose his job was Frank Kameny. He was an astronomer for the Army Map Service, and he took a trip to Los Angeles where he was arrested for kissing a man on a beach. And when word of that got back to Washington, D.C., he was fired. And he sued, took his case to the Supreme Court, and lost. The Supreme Court refused to hear his case. But Frank Kameny kind of had the last laugh. He founded the Mattachine Society chapter of Washington, D.C. in the early 60s, and in 2010, he was at Obama's signing of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He was in the room when Obama signed that. You also have the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act. This was an update to the Immigration Act of 1917, and in this act, they explicitly forbade homosexuals from immigrating to the United States. There are a number of reports and hearings where they talk about this explicitly, and this is a little copy of one of the hearings where the copy of the bill is there, and it says, homosexuals and perverts are excluded co nomine. This class is presently excludable under the term constitutionally psychopathic inferiority. So they make it very clear that homosexuals cannot immigrate into the United States. But again, during all this upheaval, all these bad things, there are some good things that happen during this time period. In 1958, the Supreme Court offers a glimmer of hope to the LGBT community. Mattachine Society had a publication called One, and One magazine was seized in the early 1950s as being obscene and undeliverable. This is one of the issues that was seized, and there's a little note that talks about how the previous issue was seized at the Washington and Los Angeles post office because of its subject matter, and that they're going to fight this in court. And they fought it in court. They went to the district court. The district court ruled against them because of the Comstock Act. They appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which was a very different Ninth Circuit at the time, and they agreed that the magazine was obscene and could not be mailed. But then they appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't hear the case as they normally would, but they still issued an opinion. And the entire opinion is this little paragraph here. And what they're basically saying here is the judgment of the Ninth Circuit is reversed. And this had major impact because this is pre-internet. You couldn't do a mass emailing. The only way people could communicate was through the postal mail, and to be able to do so privately. This allowed the LGBTQ community to communicate with itself and to organize and to move. So this one little tiny document had major impact on the LGBTQ community moving forward. Move on to 1967. This isn't explicitly about LGBTQ community at the time, but it has been used later on in support of marriage equality. The Lovings were a white man, African-American woman who were living in Virginia where mixed-race marriage was illegal. They went to Maryland and got married, moved back to Virginia, got arrested because they were two people with different races who were married, and they sued. And the Supreme Court found that that was unconstitutional. under the 14th Amendment. And this is a quote from the case. "Marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. To deny this fundamental freedom on so unsupportable a basis as the racial classifications embodied in these statutes, classifications so directly subversive of the principle of equality at the heart of the 14th Amendment, is surely to deprive all the state citizens of liberty without due process of law." And you can hear that echoing in the Obergefell decision 50 years later. Fast forward a little bit further. These aren't specifically government information. Newspaper reports about the Stonewall riots. Stonewall was a gay bar in New York City. At the time, it was illegal to serve alcohol to homosexuals, and Stonewall was a bar for Puerto Rican drag queens and other people of color, and the bar was raided. And that night, they fought back. June 28th, 1969. This is considered the start of the modern gay rights movement, and things changed really quickly. That was June 28th. July 1st, Norton v. Macy. This was a case where a NASA budget analyst was fired for being gay, for being a homosexual, and he sued. And the court found that they can't fire him just because he's a homosexual, because there's nothing in him being a homosexual that prevents him from doing his job. And William Eskridge in 2004 wrote that the Civil Service Commission, this is the agency that hires federal employees, had to explain its policy for the first time, indicating that it did not exclude homosexuals per se, only people who engaged in overt homosexual conduct that became public through an arrest or general knowledge. And the court found that Macy had to be reinstated in his job. It's the first time that it happened, and it was the end of that executive order from the Eisenhower era. And again, things started moving very quickly. In 1970s, you have the introduction of the Equality Act of 1974 to prohibit discrimination based on sex, marital status, and sexual orientation. The Civil Rights Amendments of 1975, which would have prohibited discrimination on the basis of affectional or sexual preference and other purposes. These were introduced by Bella Abzug of New York. She was a leading feminist at the time, and when she ran for her seat, she ran under the slogan, "This woman's place is in the House of Representatives." You also have the pros and cons of legalizing victimless crimes. This was a Congressional Research Service report. Congressional Research Service is an arm of the Library of Congress. They publish short reports for members of Congress. And this report in particular was on what would happen if victimless crimes were legalized: homosexuality, drug use, prostitution. And this had never been written about before or explored by the federal government, but they started doing this in 1975. You have Ford being asked in 1976 about funding for a homosexual conference from the National Endowment of Humanities. This foreshadows future fights that come later on. You have Carter in 1978 making a statement for everyone to vote no against Proposition 6 in California. That was the Briggs Initiative, which would have prohibited homosexuals and lesbians and trans people from being hired as educators in the state. If you've seen the movie Milk or know Harvey Milk's story, that's the initiative that he's fighting against. And this is another slide that really, like the Comstock Law, you can't really talk about LGBTQ history without talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution was proposed in the 1970s. It would have mandated, it would have prohibited discrimination based on sex in the United States. It failed to gather enough states to pass Congress at the time. They were given a deadline. You have Carter making statements about people needing to speak up about the validity of this law, why it's needed. But even though it failed, I wouldn't count it out because Illinois ratified the Equal Rights Amendment in May of this year. And there have been a number of articles published recently that any limits that were imposed on the ERA are unconstitutional. And the reason being is they point to the 27th Amendment, which is on congressional pay raises going into effect after the next election. And that amendment was proposed in 1789 and ratified in 1992. So it could still happen. 1980s to present, there's a lot of material that the US government publishes. And again, another topic that we can't cover in its entirety in this presentation is the federal response to HIV/AIDS. Vast, a lot of information is out there. I recommend, if you want to know the history of this, to check out the HIV timeline. There's a lot of history on this. HIV was first seen in gay and bisexual men in the early 1980s in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. It took many years for the federal government to actually do something about it. There were a lot of protests, a lot of things that happened, many thousands of people died. But the thing that came out of this is that it prompted the United States to talk about sexuality and health in a way that had not happened before. People needed to talk about protecting themselves if they were going to have sex. What did this mean? How did this affect opening up this topic that had never been really discussed before? Or if it had been discussed, it had been discussed in closed circles, in quiet corners, in dark places, but now it was coming out in the open because it was a matter of life or death. In Congress, you have Jerry Studs from Massachusetts, who was outed in a congressional page scandal in 1983. Even though he was outed, he continued serving another 6 terms. Barney Frank was outed during an ethics scandal in 1989, and ironically, the charge was led by Larry Craig of Idaho. You have the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts funding wars in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And you have the Supreme Court decision of Bowers v. Hardwick. Bowers was a gay man who was arrested in his apartment after his roommate let the police officer serve a warrant to him, and he was engaged in sexual contact with his partner at the time. This was in Georgia. He sued, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that sodomy laws at the time were constitutional. 5-10 years after this decision, there were a number of Supreme Court justices, when asked what was a decision that they did not feel comfortable with, this was one that they referred to as saying this was bad law. And it did get overturned. We'll look at that. Move into the 1990s. We're going to look at some bad things that happened in the 1990s first, and then we'll look at some good things that happened in the 1990s. The 1990 decennial census was the first time it allowed people to choose if they were married and the sex of their partner. And for those who filled out that they were married to same-sex partners, the census went in and changed the sex of one of the partners so that it was the opposite sex. They admitted to this in the late 2000s. There were continued fights over the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, HIV/AIDS funding. And if you go into and read some of the testimony in the congressional record and hearings, you get some really nasty and graphic comments from California folks like Norton and Dan Meyer and Jesse Helms from North Carolina. Clinton gets elected in 1992 on the promise that he would open up the military to LGBT folks, and a bad compromise was made for don't ask, don't tell. The military wasn't going to ask, and as long as you didn't tell anyone, you would be able to serve in the military. But this led to a number of bad things happening. 1994, 1995, Hawaii starts looking at possibility of allowing same-sex marriage in the state, and the whole country freaks out, and Congress passes the Defense of Marriage Act to prevent other states from recognizing marriages performed in a particular state. But we do have some good things, again, that happened in the 1990s. The Immigration Act of 1990 finally removed homosexuality as grounds for exclusion. So now homosexuals, LGBTQ folks can immigrate into the United States without that being a reason for exclusion. This opened up refugee status for LGBT folks. The 1990 Americans with Disability Act defines transvesticism does not constitute a mental disability. So that's the first time the government has ever stepped in that. They had never made a statement on that. 1994, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. This had been rumblings of this had been happening since the 1970s. It never went anywhere. This first time it got a hearing in 1994. 1996, Romer v. Evans. This was a Supreme Court case out of Colorado. Colorado put up for a referendum the ability to remove protections in the state for LGBT folks if a city or a municipality passed them. And it passed, and they sued, and the Supreme Court found that discrimination that specifically singles out LGBT people is a violation of the 14th Amendment. So that was a victory. In 1999, you have the first presidential proclamation of Gay Pride Month by President Clinton. First time a president ever said that. Moving forward, we get to 2000s, more recent things. Boy Scouts v. Dale. The Boy Scouts have a constitutional right to ban LGBTQ members based on their First Amendment protected right to expressive association. They've since kind of reversed this in the last few years and have been more progressive in this area. You had various amendments being proposed to the U.S. Constitution against same-sex marriage, and some of these amendments got support from then-President George W. Bush. During the Bush administration, there was no gay pride proclamation. Many people were removed from military service during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Translators, certain servicemen and women, and even the U.S. Army issued an Army comic book on this. You can actually go in and read this. It's about a 20-page comic book describing the policy, what would happen if you made it known that you were gay, lesbian, bisexual. And there were a host of congressional scandals. From Larry Craig's congressional scandal to another page scandal with all kinds of different scandals dealing with LGBT folks. Some good things that happened in the 2000s was the census. They did not change the sex of those reporting who their partners were. But their relationship, if they reported that they were married, was changed to unmarried partners, because at the time, in 2000, same-sex marriage was not available in the country. But you can get data on same-sex married couples from 2010 to present. This is available. You can actually get this information. In 2011, the Department of Education hosted a LGBTQ youth summit looking at the issues that LGBTQ youth face in schools and elsewhere. And they hosted this until 2015. The Equal Employment Opportunities Commission filed lawsuits on behalf of transgendered people, suing against the discrimination that they faced on their gender identity. In 2016, the Department of Justice issued a letter on transgendered students' right to use the bathroom of their choice, and we'll talk about what happened after. Since 2009, many agencies have issued rules and guidelines on LGBTQ issues, talking about LGBTQ people as a special population. This had not happened before. Some specific things that happened out of Congress. You have the 2009 Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Matthew Shepard was the gay college student who was beaten and left for dead in Wyoming. James Byrd Jr. was an African-American man who was beaten and dragged to his death behind a truck in Texas. This expanded federal hate crimes protections on sexual orientation and gender. 2010, Obama and Congress repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, and Obama signed it. And you have the first openly gay senator elected in Tammy Baldwin, who was just reelected on Tuesday. The Supreme Court struck down Bowers v. Hardwick in the case Lawrence v. Texas, very similar case. Case came up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally reversed itself, saying that state sodomy laws are unconstitutional. In 2013, the United States versus Windsor, Edie Windsor, her partner died, and she had a massive tax bill, and had she been able to get married, she would not have had to pay the tax bill, so she sued based on that, and the courts found that that was unconstitutional. She was married in Canada, but the marriage wasn't recognized in the United States, and had it been recognized, she wouldn't have to pay that. And the big decision was the Oberfell versus Hodges. This is the same-sex marriage case in 2015. The 14th Amendment requires that states issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. The president, 2009 to 2016, Obama declared June as LGBTQ Pride Month. Shortly after Obama got into office, he issued a memorandum to extend benefits to same-sex partners of federal employees. That had not happened before. In 2011, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton delivered a speech pressing for LGBTQ human rights around the world. The White House was lit up in rainbow colors. That is where this little image comes from the first slide and all the little corner slides. They lit up for the Oberfell decision. And in 2016, the Stonewall Inn was slated to become a national monument. And now we get to the current administration. Shortly after Trump came into office, the LGBTQ content was scrubbed from many federal websites, including the White House, the Department of Labor, the State Department, and the Health and Human Services Department. This had not happened before. Health information had never been scrubbed from websites. Department of Labor information had never been scrubbed from websites on special populations. This was a first. They're starting to ignore the LGBTQ community in their data collection. The National Survey of Older American Act participants. This is a survey to encourage and assist state and local agencies in the development of comprehensive and coordinated in-home and community-based long-term care service, so like home-delivered meals, transportation, and other case management issues for older adults age 60 and older. They started to incorporate LGBTQ questions into the survey, and they removed them in the last year. They removed questions from the National Crime Victimization Surveys, which gathers information from victims of crimes. And one of the big ones is the Census Barriers and Motivators study. This is used to discover and resolve barriers to participation in the 2020 census, and questions pertaining to LGBT community have been removed from this. The Census 2020, though, still is going to contain a question on opposite sex or same-sex husband or wife or spouse or partner. So that question is still going to be there. We'll still get data on same-sex married couples.
May I ask,
Mm-hmm.
which branch of the government decided to change the data collection? How does it work?
So that comes from the administration. So a lot of the agencies. So the question was, how do the questions get changed? Yes. So the agencies. So the administration, whoever's in charge of the president, is in charge of overseeing most of the federal agencies in the government. And if the presidential administration leans one way or another, you'll start to see that reflected in the agendas of the agencies and the data gathering information that they were doing. So that's where this is coming from. It's come from the executive branch, yes. It's at the direction of the president and the White House. You started seeing withdrawal of Title IX guidance on the transgender student restroom use. This was Jeff Sessions issuing a statement less than a year after the previous letter was written. You have a proposed military ban on transgender personnel that was announced last year. This has been tied up in courts, and so far it has not been moving forward. Masterpiece Cake Shop, LTD versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. This was a Supreme Court case on if someone who's a same-sex married couple wants a cake being baked for them, does the bakery have to do it? And the Supreme Court kind of skirted the issue on this and kind of issued a really strange opinion that really didn't resolve the question. And then in the last couple of weeks, Title IX interpretations to possibly erase transgendered issues. So right now, the interpretation of Title IX is that it applies to people who are transgender, and the administration is looking to change that so that Title IX cannot be used to support transgendered rights. There's a lot of stuff going on. And if you want to keep track of all this stuff, or if you want to read any of this information, we have a LibGuide that Kelly and I have put together. And this has, I don't know if you can see this. There we go. And this has some information about the presentation itself, hosted at UC San Diego. You can see a copy of this presentation, get our contact information, but it has a timeline. It has a timeline of all the documents. So everything that is coming out present to today, we are putting in there. We are also have all the historic documents going back to 1830 is the earliest one that we have on here. You can go in here and read the reports about WIWA, read the hearing, the Sodomy hearing on Chinese Exclusion Act. Some of those are in proprietary databases from like ProQuest Congressional, and we've been able to get ProQuest to allow us permission to post them full text, so you can actually get them from this guide. And there's also some information on some additional sources on where to go for other information and read more about this history. Okay. So that is the guide. So you may be asking yourself, what can I do with all this information? And so what we did at Berkeley, I'll give you an idea. What we did at Berkeley, after I did the presentation, that was done in October of 2016. After the election in November, after Trump was elected, I did the presentation on campus. And we had a room of about 40 graduate students, a dozen professors, and a bunch of other folks. And we had a positive response to this. And so what we decided to do with it was to turn it into an exhibit. And so these are images from the exhibit that we did over the spring and summer. The exhibit closed in September, where we just printed out some of these documents and a number of different things that can go with this to provide context to some of these documents. Government documents are dry and boring to look at, but when you put them in context and what the effects are, it kind of starts to get people excited and interested. And so if you've never done an exhibit, one of the easiest things to do, this is a little quick guide, is to choose a space in your library. Do you have a space in your library to think about? How big is the space? Because that can answer questions on what your theme is going to be. If you have a large space, you can incorporate things from a much longer time period. If you have a small case, maybe you can just look at one of these documents and put some images around it. Identify material. Figure out what kind of where your focus is going to be, and give yourself time to do this work, because this can take a while to do. Pick a document or selection of documents and that go with your theme. And keep in mind that government information is free of copyright, so you can print it out, you can copy it, you can do whatever you want with it most of the time, especially if it's a federal document. State documents gets a little trickier. We recommend using lots of images and secondary information to provide context and to supplement what's going on. That puts this material in context. What is this about? What was the effect? And think about telling a story. There are lots of stories in this history that have not been told yet, that you can go in and explore and pull out and maybe relate it to your own community. Considering partnering with a local organization. We partnered with the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender History Association, History Archive in the San Francisco, and they allowed us t-shirts, to borrow t-shirts and buttons and other political material that we were able to use in the exhibit. We also worked with the San Francisco Public Library to get copies of the marriage licenses that were invalidated after Newsom allowed same-sex marriage, and then that was overturned by the California Supreme Court, and everyone who got married got a little invalidated marriage license returned to them. And the letter, yes, letters, exactly. And so we put up, who was it? Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons' copy of their letter that we got from San Francisco Public Library. And prepare for controversy. Some of this stuff can still raise some issues, and we drafted talking points. We had done an exhibit 3-4 years earlier on the history of sex education in the United States, and we got a lot of pushback on that. We showed things from the teens from like 1915, 1916 on encouraging parents to talk to their kids about sex and health, which stuff you don't really think about where they were talking about that, but they were. And we got pushback from that. We got some coverage in right-wing media press about this. And we had some talking points drafted. And so when we did this exhibit, we thought, okay, let's draft some talking points. But nothing like that happened. It was very positive. We had a positive experience. We put a comment book out that anyone who saw the exhibit could write comments in. And we got comments about, someone wrote about they'd moved to the United States from South America, and the only way they were able to stay in the country was because they were able to marry their partner and able to live in the country. Comments from students who were visiting the university who were talking about where they go to school in various states, something like this would not happen, and they were glad to see that there's a place where they can see this. And what I would recommend is every library is unique. Think about what your institution might support and maybe challenge it a little bit. Progress doesn't happen unless people are willing to push those envelopes and push those boundaries. And I think this history, you'll see a lot of people pushing boundaries and pushing things to make sure that everyone is included, regardless of whatever difference there might be. And with that, I thank you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. My contact information is here. And thank you again.